Good evening, President Ragland, members of the board, and Dr. Smith. Tonight we're going to talk about this presentation that we did in Bloomington last week. It was an Indiana conference for school districts. There were about 500 people in attendance. 100 school districts were represented, and last count there were about 200 people that were on the waiting list. So it was very well attended by districts across the state. On the first day, EVSC was one of the plenary sessions along with CASEL and the Indiana Youth Service Bureau. And then on day two, myself and Dr. Smith were able to do a breakout session on some of the additional work that we were doing, and then also Lauren Hartmayer, one of our kindergarten teachers, on the work with the SEL curriculum. So it was really nice, and it was a great opportunity for EVSC to be showcased, particularly with the work that we've been doing with GAIN. So this was an hour presentation, so I'm going to spare everybody tonight and not do the hour version, but we'll do about 8 minutes, right? And I'll talk slow as best I can. So what I'd actually thought about tonight is just when we were setting this up, I know I had a lot of angst trying to think about how to, even in an hour, talk about some of the complexities of this work and everything that we've been doing over the past 5 to 6 years. So we started with the why, really, in talking about what does it actually mean to educate the whole child. And what is that actual definition? I know when we began to develop GAIN and even some of our continuous improvement plan metrics, you really have to understand what the end game is, right? Like, what are you actually measuring? What does it actually look like? And how do you actually know when you've educated the whole child? That really is critical to understanding the systems and practices we need to have in place. And the interesting part about that is there's actually some data that exists. The Preschool projects was started in the mid-1960s in Ypsilanti, Michigan, had about 160 students that were considered high risk. And the idea was at the time, which is pretty much still the idea around early childhood, is that we would give these kids sort of a cognitive head start. And we measured it among all kinds of variables, mostly cognitive. And of course, they were ahead when they entered in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. But by third grade, the kids had caught up to each other, right? So the kids that didn't get to participate in the Preschool project were the same as the kids that didn't get to. And it was actually deemed a failure at the time. So because the kids caught up cognitively, they felt like those early childhood programs really didn't do what we thought that they should do. And that's a really important point to really think about right now, because when we're talking about predictors of future success and we're talking about educating the whole child, the only measure that they really decided at that moment that determined whether or not the kids failed were a cognitive measure. So interestingly enough, they followed this group of kids for the past 40 years, and we have some great longitudinal data on them. So this is what we've learned now that these kids are actually adults, is the kids that completed the Preschool project were more likely to graduate from high school, they were more likely to be employed, more likely to make more than $25,000, and they were less likely to be arrested. So positive outcome points that actually had nothing to do with their IQ. And so, again, when you're thinking about educating the whole child, that one data point, that cognitive measure by itself, isn't always the best predictor about whether or not our kids are going to be successful throughout every stage of their life. So this economist, of all people, decided to research this, and over the course of about 3 years, he found some notes on some other data points that were actually captured. And I know most of you on here will be surprised to learn that they did surveys in the 1960s and 70s, just like we do surveys today. And so what the teachers rated the kids on were things like swearing and attendance and relationships. Again, some very familiar kinds of metrics that we actually also keep data on. And what he found was, after 3 years of really disaggregating this data, is that these data points, curiosity, self-control, and social fluidity, were accounted for 2/3 of the adults' positive life successes. Pretty amazing, right? And so, again, from an educational standpoint, we're talking about educating our whole children and making sure that they're successful throughout every stage. That cognitive measure really is just one piece of who they really are. One of the things that's important to note about this program is it was hands-on learning. The students were encouraged, and the program was set up for the students to do the thinking. very similar to the direction that we're also taking. The other part of it that I think was also critical is the teachers spent an hour and a half a week in the home with the families, talking to them about what the educational program was about. So I think the combination of the learning experiences with the family engagement piece of it, which is ESSA, also contributed to these outcomes. So when you fast forward now to the 2000s, we have some data points that shouldn't be surprising based upon what the Perry Preschool Project showed us. So executive functioning, things like working memory, cognitive self-control, and attentional skills are the foundation upon which children learn to read, write, and do math. So there are some biological and neurobiological skills that have to be in place for our kids to be able to learn how to read. And those skills don't necessarily have to do exactly with just reading itself. So when you look at working memory and attention, those executive function skills, you find that they're actually better predictors of whether or not kids are going to learn how to read or do math. It's a really important data point here, that executive function, kids' ability to remember sounds and letter combinations, their ability to focus their attention, those skills, which are executive functions, are better predictors of students' reading and math skills than their reading or math skills. So those are scores that we need to know when our kids are coming in. If those are the better predictors, those are scores and data points that we need to have. And that also ties to this. So this was a study that was done actually in Chicago. When you look at the three variables in the middle, content knowledge, academic skills, and students' non-cognitive factors, those things that Heckman measured, curiosity, right, those persistence, sometimes grit and growth mindset are also in there. Those non-cognitive skills, academic and content knowledge, are measured by grades. Only content knowledge and academic skills are measured by test scores. Interestingly enough, grades are the better predictor of graduation. Test scores by themselves are not the best predictor of graduation. And so, and this was also part of Heckman's research at the time, because our students, we have a GED, which is a wonderful opportunity for some kids that need it in order to obtain a high school equivalency. But the problem sometimes is then employability skills, which are those non-cognitive factors, don't actually predict their ability to get or keep a job. So if we're only focusing on whether or not a kid can pass the GED, we're missing all kinds of opportunities to actually, and I'll use the term develop the whole child, to ensure that they are successful throughout every stage of their life. We can't skip steps, right? Like just giving more reading and just doing more math isn't going to ensure that our students not only graduate, but are also employed and can sustain employment. So, and then this, and I have to give credit here, this slide is from Dr. Smith. There you go. Give you credit. Okay. I know I didn't give him credit in Bloomington, so he had to tell me about it. But this slide was actually completed through the Indiana Chamber of Commerce in 2015, and it's not surprising that when you look at the skills that are most challenging for the employers to find in their new hires, you're looking at interpersonal skills, responsibility, self-discipline, communication skills, and their ability to think critically. So those non-cognitive skills were the skills that were most lacking in the potential new hires for businesses across the state of Indiana. So this isn't a national survey. This was actually a survey that was completed in Indiana. So you can kind of see, we were trying to set it up for the folks, like what does it mean to educate the whole child? It's not really just the cognitive pieces, but it's executive function. And then these are actually self-regulation skills where we're talking about the ability to communicate, socialize, think critically, and that's a whole nother layer of development that has to be developed intentionally. It's not something that is learned vicariously. There are actually sensitive windows in our children's development for these critical skills to develop, which is why early childhood is a very important time, and any of that time period prior to age 7 for that direct instruction and opportunity to develop some of these non-cognitive skills. So just to point out, working memory intentional skills, which are those executive functions, actually don't predict their social interaction skills. And I think that also speaks to the complexity of it. So we can develop executive functions, but you also have to intentionally develop those social, what we call social self-regulation skills, social intelligence, the ability to walk into a room and take a look and figure out what the social norms are and be able to participate in those social norms. That is in the domain of social self-regulation. So when we were developing GAIN, when we were developing all of the constructs for a vision for teaching and learning, these are each layers that have to be intentionally attended to and developed. It's not as easy to just teach a rule. We're going to walk into a room and pay attention to where everybody is sitting. Kids, there's a whole process for kids to be able to do that successfully. And if we attend to that early and throughout their education, then our students will graduate with those non-cognitive skills. So just on the biological level, and I won't spend too much time on these, but when we talk about why are our kids struggling, some of our students are struggling. This is a recent study that our kids that are in low income and high stress homes actually have part of their brain that is thinner. And that can be seen as early as 16 to 18 months. That impacts the development of language and those executive function skills. So if we screen students when they come in for these executive function skills, then we can also develop them. I think that's really an important aspect when we think about instruction. We're looking at root cause as to why our students are struggling to read. Yes?
Is that related to diet or stimulation or?
So this isn't, it's not a, it's a correlational study, so obviously without controlling for those variables, you wouldn't be able to say specifically.
All we know is low income.
Correct, it's low, correct, yes. Yeah, you wouldn't be able to say definitively without doing an actual experiment, correct.
Susan, can you talk about, though, what prolonged toxic stress does to the development of the brain,
Yes.
which would be an indication that we see in the images?
Correct. So I'll just, those are that's the next two slides. So when we're talking about ACEs, which are adverse childhood experience, so we know high stress and particularly stress in any one of these domains. This is a study that I think we've talked about before, but it is a seminal study, particularly as it relates to understanding why some of our students have higher risk indicators than others. And it's important to note just really a couple things about the ACEs study. Is one, it was done on a population of about 17,000 patients, predominantly white, predominantly educated. And it demonstrated that the higher your ACE score in the absence of buffers, those buffers are relationships, then you do have changes to the architecture of the brain going up typically past 2.5 ACEs. Or adverse childhood events. And that's really important for education for a couple of reasons. One is at 2.5 ACEs is when you start to see students' enrollment in special education increase, behavior problems, learning problems also tend to increase with each one, but only at 2.5. And since about 63% of us have at least one, that's pretty important to understand. The other part of that is also understanding that it's in the absence of a buffer that you're going to have changes to the architecture of your brain. A lot of us have had at least one ACE, but with a buffer, you're not going to see those impacts. And so what Dr. Smith is talking about is this is a picture of a brain architecture that's been significantly impacted by adverse childhood experiences. And those non-cognitive skills that we're talking about are in the top part of the brain. And you can see that on the right, which is where a student would have been affected by toxic stress, you can see that those neural pathways aren't there. And this is what that architecture looks like. So when we were developing GAIN, we knew this neurobiology and we really wanted to approach it not from how do you treat kids, but how do you ensure neurological health? What kind of environment do we need to have? What kind of experiences and learning opportunities do our students need to have so that even if they came to us and had a high number of ACEs, we were ensuring an environment that could treat that. So. And then this slide really just highlights that the more adversity, the more likely that you are to have those developmental delays. And when we're thinking about, from an educational standpoint, this is the why, and we're thinking about everything that our kids need in order to be successful, you have to start at the foundation and develop those relationships, executive functions, and then non-cognitive skills to ensure that they're going to be able to read and do math and be successful at every stage of their life. So the whole child is pretty complicated, but I feel like in EVSC, particularly with our GAIN framework, vision for teaching and learning, and the social emotional competencies that we've developed, we have good metrics and systems in place to begin that process. So.